Welcome, everyone. I'm AJ Albanek, a Senior Philanthropy Officer at the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. We are grateful you're able to join us for this webinar about the Young Center's work with LGBTQIA immigrant and asylum-seeking children seeking protection in the United States who are escaping violence and persecution because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. At this webinar, Young Center staff from around the country will share stories of our advocacy for these children, describing the unique needs of LGBTQIA immigrant children and how we tailor our advocacy to meet children where they are and ensure they land somewhere safe. A content warning for today's webinar: some of the stories we are sharing include mentions of violence and abuse experienced children. Also, all names used in reference to children we serve are pseudonyms. One more quick note: on the bottom of your screen, you should have a chat box where you can submit your questions throughout the presentation. We are reserving plenty of time for questions afterwards. We will, however, end the webinar promptly at 1 p.m. Central. We also recommend switching to speaker view for best viewing. This year, more than 120,000 unaccompanied immigrant children are expected to arrive at our border. This is the result of a number of factors. Thousands of unaccompanied children were deported directly from the border during the prior administration. Some were forced to wait in dangerous conditions in Mexico under the prior administration's Remain in Mexico policy. And many of these children are now returning to seek safety. Other children are fleeing because of the instability in Central American countries that leave children vulnerable with no government authority to turn to when their homes or communities are unsafe. Especially vulnerable are LGBTQIA children, many of whom are also among the children who experience additional violence and abuse on their journeys here. To improve our ability to support these children, the Young Center partnered with a sister nonprofit called True Child in this past January for continuing education for our staff. True Child is a network of experts and researchers dedicated to helping policymakers and practitioners challenge rigid gender norms through intersectional approaches that reconnect race, class, and gender. Our education at the Young Center will be ongoing. But today, for the next 40 minutes or so, you're going to meet 4 Young Center staff members and learn about some of the successes your support has made possible, as well as some of the challenges we continue to face on the front lines of our work with LGBTQIA immigrant children seeking safety. We'll start with Jose Ortiz Rosales, our Los Angeles office's social worker, who is going to give you an overview of the unique challenges faced by LGBTQIA kids seeking protection and how a child-centric approach is essential for serving them. Jose has years of experience working with unaccompanied children across the country, serving as a post-release case manager for unaccompanied youth, conducting home studies for detained youth awaiting reunification, and working with immigration attorneys to ensure their clients' voices are centered. Jose?
Thank you so much, AJ. Before we begin, I kind of wanted to give folks a global understanding of the conditions that many of the LGBTQIA children and youth come from. 69 countries criminalize consensual same-sex conduct, and where same-sex conduct is not criminalized, LGBTQIA folks face persecution and violence, and that can include domestic violence, sexual assaults, and even murder in some occasions. Additionally, they also face discrimination in areas like education, employment, housing, and healthcare. And we could say that this is more of an institutional discrimination that they additionally face aside from the social systems that they might be a part of. So when we talk about vulnerabilities of LGBTQIA children and youth, what we mean is that children and youth are particularly vulnerable to threats to their safety and well-being. And what we mean is violent attacks, bullying or harassment, and many times stigma and social exclusion. And when instances happen of where they get isolated or abandoned by parents and peers, they also can be disproportionately have some levels of suicide, homelessness, and food insecurity. Many times in their home countries or the countries that they're coming from, these attacks or just discrimination and persecution are at times underreported and often not properly investigated and prosecuted, which then a lot of times it leaves many of the youth and children to feel like the system is not on their side and they don't feel protected in the community or in any country that they currently live. And there isn't that much support for them in those countries, which many times leads them to have to migrate to the United States or other countries that they feel can protect them. And I kind of want to dig in deeper a little bit more into the vulnerabilities and challenges of LGBTQIA youth and children as it relates into what influences them and what their experience can mean. One thing that we look into is them in an environment. And when we're talking about youth and children who are undergoing removal proceedings in the immigration system, one thing that is very important to understand is the environment that they're currently at or where they're coming from or where they have been. This allows us to understand that people, places, and environments dictate the experiences that the children and youth will or have experienced. And many of these experiences really shape how the youth and the children will either behave or respond to new environments, to new people that they meet, or to new systems that they're encountering. Because the LGBTQIA youth and children are undergoing and maneuvering through the immigration system, it doesn't define them, nor do the legal issues define them. And they don't dictate how we as partners, as adult partners, interact with them. And our engagement and our approach to youth of this community should also take into account the intersectionality of their identities. Many times LGBTQIA youth and children come with different identities that sometimes us as adults kind of just focus on one of their identities. But to better approach and better serve youth in these situations is to better have an understanding of their different identities, such as social class, gender, sexuality, disability, nationality, ethnicity, and race. This is important because their identity is who makes the youth and the child. And then that allows us to have a full and a bigger picture of who they are as a person. And the way that this really interacts with the environment is just how they're going to behave and interact with the different systems that they will be maneuvering through. You know, all in all, we want to take into account overlapping identities and experiences as we engage with youth and children. So what are some challenges that LGBTQIA youth face in immigration proceedings? So one is safety. Many of them fear of additional harassment and abuse by others that they're meeting or they're living with. This harassment can look like bullying or exclusion, like I mentioned before. But a lot of times, and something that we don't really think about is that many of them might have a perception of mental health services. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times, depending on the country that the youth come from, mental health services or even clinical services have been used to try to change them or treat their sexual orientation as a mental illness. So automatically, we cannot assume that they would accept or even engage in mental health services just because we think that it would be helpful for them. They might perceive that some of their life experiences are embarrassing or not going to be believed, which is why it's important for us to establish rapport with youth and children from the get-go without fully kind of immersing ourselves into what we think that their needs are. In regards to safety, they a lot of times are reluctant to disclose information pertaining to their sexuality and gender because they fear being discriminated against. And like AJ mentioned earlier, many of them face discrimination even in transit to the United States. So their defense mechanisms are even heightened at the time that they come into the immigration system here in the United States. So that's an important thing to kind of take into account. And many times, because the youth kind of go into this immigration system, there's not consistency in who works with them and who they interact with. So for them, that is really hard to kind of be able to be open with and be vulnerable, and also be feeling safe in who they talk to about their experience. Another challenge is that there's always a lack of communication. Folks get asked really personal questions, but they're not told why those personal questions are being asked. Many times we want to focus on their legal case, on their legal arguments, but a lot of times we don't stop ourselves to, by us, I mean adults, we don't stop ourselves from taking it at their pace. And they're not given agency to share the information. They don't get allowed to dictate when they share and how to share it. And a third challenge is that these systems sometimes don't allow for inclusive environments that does not foster a sense of belonging. And what I mean by that is, for example, they're not housed with their preferred gender identity. They don't have appropriate health or medical access and as they encounter these systems, and their agency gets taken away many times. And what I mean by that is that they're not allowed to live their own life on their own terms. And lastly, our immigration system is not built around children's best interests. And an example of that is proper language and cultural understanding. And you can see this when interpreters are used, right? Many times we forget that LGBTQIA youth and children are being persecuted in these countries. So people who might speak their own language, they might be worried of, because they might see them as being part of their own community, and they don't know whether that information is going to get back to the community or the culture that they belong to. So it's really explaining to them the purpose of using an interpreter, the purpose of needing to communicate in a way that they understand and they're able to communicate with you. And then also there's a lack of understanding of how their identity is viewed in their own culture and their country. Many times their experiences are generalized and compared to the LGBTQIA community in the United States. And for them, that's not fair because experiences are so different in every country. We could go to the next one. So how can we support youth who are part of the LGBT community? Here at the Young Center, we tailor interactions based on every youth. We do see every youth as unique to themselves. We actively acknowledge that different circumstances under which youths arrive are unique to them. We establish rapport by building space of trust and communication. And I say building and not creating, because the sense of establishing rapport is that you build off of every interaction that you have with the youth. And we don't generalize or assume that their experiences is the same as others that are part of the LGBTQIA community. We are consistent adults. We visit them on a weekly basis or as consistent as we can. We are consistent in the way we communicate with them. We are consistent in our approach in which we work with them. And we see them as partners, not as someone that we're helping. And that's very important for youth because they themselves are very resilient, but then they themselves already have the tools. And at times they just need a partner to highlight those tools that they need, that they have to be able to advocate for themselves or express their needs to others. Um, and and my talk about being partners with them, we give them agency and identifying their needs and advocacy approaches. For example, we give them space to share. When there's needs that they identify or they share with us, before we even give them an idea of how to go about it, we tend to ask them or give them space to either they themselves bringing these needs up or concerns with the provider or the stakeholder, or having us be the ones to do that on their behalf if they want us to. This is giving them agency because they are then giving you the option of how they want the situation to be handled. And we explore with them the concerns, thoughts, and ideas. Many times youth and children might have an idea or thought of what they need or want to say, but a lot of times they can't articulate it to stakeholders or can't put it into words. So we always give that space where they can do that with us, and then they have them decide on how they want to proceed with the needs. When they need to advocate or have hard conversation with providers, we show up. We could either be in the room with them in those conversations, or we could even prep them or practice with them on how to talk, how they would talk to other adults. As you all know, and if you could just remember to when you were a youth or a child, how hard it was just to even say something to another adult. So for us, that partnership is that as well, and that is part of our approach with youth from the LGBTQIA community. And then we view them we view the youth and the children as capable and understand their viewpoint, their worldview, any oppression or discrimination that they may have experienced as well. So all in all, we like to encourage and practice culture humility, and also understanding that we also have our own limitations. We're humans, and we also understand that at times we might not know everything, even if we're adults. And what I mean by cultural humility is that we're open to learning from the youth and the children, and how about their culture and their identity, but then also understanding that there's things that we have a lot to learn from. And at the end, youth teach us about their unique places at the intersections of their different identities. And our role is to be willing to learn about their experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Next, we have two Young Center Child Advocate Program staff members who are going to share stories about several of the LGBTQIA children we've worked with in recent years. Our Chicago managing attorney, Kelly Albanet Cripps, first started working with unaccompanied immigrant children as a Young Center volunteer child advocate 12 years ago. Before joining the Young Center staff in 2016, she clerked for a federal district court judge and worked in private practice. Jessie Beecher Bell is the case support specialist in our Houston office. She is a longtime social service provider and administrator in low-income housing around the US, with experience in journalism and translation work as well. Kelly, you can take it from here.
Thank you, AJ, and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today to talk about the opportunities for the Young Center to advocate on behalf of LGBTQIA children in federal custody. My colleague Jessie and I are going to share just a couple stories with you today, and I'm going to start out by talking about our work with Miguel. And Miguel is a 15-year-old youth from Guatemala who's assigned female at birth and presented as female growing up in Guatemala. But when we started working with him when he came to Chicago and was placed in federal custody here, pretty quickly after we were appointed to him, he shared with us his preference to be called by his chosen name, Miguel, and referred to with the pronouns he, him. And it was, it was beneficial to us that he felt comfortable sharing that with us early on in our engagement, which, as you'll hear from Jesse, isn't always the case. And it opened the door to many different opportunities for us to advocate on his behalf. First and foremost, with respect to that precise issue, name and pronoun usage, we were able to have conversations with his care providers, the facility staff in the building where he was living, about the importance of using that name and the pronouns that he's chosen. And we really, kind of, as Jose touched on in his presentation, took a child-led approach here, because Miguel was clear that while, in the facility, he wanted to be referred to as Miguel and with the pronouns he, him, when we went to court, he took a slightly different position. I think, from his perspective, court was a slightly more intimidating environment, one where he knew he was going to be before a judge up on a dais and, in a robe and holding a gavel. And, kind of, he took the position that he wasn't ready to share that aspect of his identity in that setting in front of, a number of other children and adults. And so when we went to court, we, referred to Miguel by the name on his birth certificate in accordance with his wishes, because, that wasn't a place where he was ready to share that piece of him yet. We were also able to do advocacy around connecting Miguel with counseling on hormone treatment therapy, so he could begin to think about whether that was something that he wanted to pursue. And, in the course of that, he was also connected with an organization in Chicago that provides health services to LGBTQIA individuals, and through them was able to start attending support groups for youth exploring their gender identities. This was in pre-pandemic times. We are also involved in advocacy to change the placements within the facility of the floor that he was on. So the facility he was at is gendered by floor, boys on some floors, girls on others. And Miguel was able to transfer to a floor, an all boys floor, where he felt more comfortable in that environment. And ultimately, with respect to the long-term plan for Miguel, he did not have a family member in the United States willing and able to receive him out of federal custody. So the option then for him was to look at placement with a long-term foster care family. And so, his identity was a key aspect of the exploration of those options there. We wanted to make sure that he was placed with a family that would be accepting and supportive of a child who is exploring their gender identity, which is not every family involved in this system. So, that was a key aspect of our advocacy around his placement in a long-term foster care home. And ultimately, he was able to be placed with a gay couple and remains there to this day. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jessie. She's going to tell you a little bit about a case that she worked on.
Thanks, Kelly. So from Kelly's story, where the Young Center child advocate and the child shared the child's gender identity from an early stage of their relationship, I have a brief story of a young person who withheld their true experience until a safe and welcoming environment became available. Throughout the story, I'll use the pseudonym Jay for this child. Jay, a 17-year-old from Honduras who was assigned female at birth and presented as female when we met him, arrived at the US border in December of 2018. Customs and Border Patrol placed Jay with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, in the Houston area shelter, where Jay struggled to acclimate to the environment, especially how the boys and the girls were strictly separated. Jay suffered scrutiny and ridicule primarily for the very small expressions of identity that Jay initially felt comfortable sharing. ORR's response to Jay's emotional struggles in detention and Jay's reaction to the scrutiny was to place Jay at a residential treatment center in Houston. The Young Center was appointed as Jay's child advocate shortly after that. We visited with Jay weekly, where we learned that Jay was an ardent follower of popular music, especially Cardi B and Anuel. Jay dressed in gym clothing and wanted to play basketball outside, even though we were obliged to spend most of our time doing arts and crafts and talking. It became clear over time that Jay was having more thoughts about gender identity, but sometimes giving clues to me and to the clinician at the center. Jay gave permission for me to speak with his mother in Honduras, but constantly asked for me to report back specifically what I had shared with his mom and what mom's reactions were. Jay was fearful his mom would discover personal information that he was not yet ready to share with his family. At the Young Center, we pushed hard for Jay to be stepped down from the treatment center or released to a less restrictive ORR setting. At that time, there was no one in the United States who could sponsor Jay and take Jay into their home. Our advocacy was successful, and ORR sent Jay to a less restrictive shelter in New York, which was closer to our actual goal in advocating in Jay's case. Our efforts were targeted at an LGBTQIA shelter that had accepted young people from ORR custody in the past, where we thought that Jay could possibly thrive. In ORR shelter still, Jay did not share information around identity and expressed frustration and fear to us about the ridicule from others and shame that Jay felt, even though in actuality, Jay was showing a strong personality and even leadership in the shelter. Jay couldn't see the strength and the perseverance that the child advocate and shelter staff could see. After weeks of advocacy and meetings, ORR finally agreed to release Jay just days prior to Jay's 18th birthday in early 2020, a time at which Jay would have otherwise been placed in ICE adult detention. Once Jay arrived at the LGBTQIA only shelter in New York City, Jay immediately changed pronouns and his name. Shelter staff communicated this to the Young Center advocate just days after his arrival. Unfortunately, the adult shelter experience was not as welcoming as we had hoped. It was at times even alienating to Jay. Spanish-speaking staff did not become available until weeks after Jay's placement. Post-detention stress and trauma did not factor into the shelter staff's approach to Jay's case. Jay ultimately left the shelter with a new friend. Together, they found a place to live in the city. Jay continues to receive supports from a New York City legal service provider and the social workers at that same agency.
And thanks so much, Jessie, for sharing that story. I'm just going to chime back in quickly with one additional note about how working with a child exploring their gender or sexual identity while they are in federal custody can also be nuanced and fraught because of how it can impact their legal case. And Jose kind of touched on this earlier on, but on one hand, it can be beneficial for a child to share with their attorney that they identify as LGBTQIA because it may be the basis for an asylum claim stemming from a well-founded fear of future persecution that a child may have in their home country. But on the other hand, of course, it's a fraught process for kids trying to try to work through the exploration of these issues. Identity for adolescents in general is something that's in flux. And it can be hard for a young person to be forced into one particular box before they're ready to be identified as such. And this is even more so for kids that we work with who are in custody in a restrictive setting. They may not feel safe in that setting. They may feel as if their exploration of their gender or sexual identity is in contravention of cultural and religious norms in which they were raised. And they may have fears about identifying themselves in a particular way to government officials based on experiences in home country. So, at the Young Center, we try to thread that needle between making sure their process of exploring their identity occurs on their own terms and at their own pace, while at the same time supporting them in sharing that information with other stakeholders, including their attorneys, when they are ready to do so, because it could be useful to, their long-term goal of seeking safety in the United States.
Thank you, Jessie and Kelly. Next up, we are hearing from Maritza Leyva Martinez about why it's important to have LGBTQIA volunteer child advocates and how you can apply. Maritza joined the Young Center in February 2017 as a volunteer with the Phoenix office. In 2019, she became the volunteer coordinator for the Young Center's office on the border in Harlingen, Texas. In her role as volunteer coordinator, Maritza recruits and coordinates training for several new volunteer cohorts in the Rio Grande Valley each year. Maritza.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. And just as a fair warning, we have landscape going on in the background. So if you hear that, my apologies. Okay, so I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the role of Young Center Child Advocates. So Young Center Child Advocates are adults who volunteer to spend time with an advocate on behalf of an individual unaccompanied immigrant child while he or she is subject to, or they, subject to deportation proceedings. Child advocates at the moment meet virtually with a child in government custody once a week for 1 hour, learn their story, and advocate for their best interests alongside Young Center attorneys and social workers. Who can be an advocate? We welcome volunteers from all cultures, professions, races, ethnicities, and social backgrounds, but advocates must be at least 21 years old. And we have a particular need for bilingual volunteers who speak, among other languages, Spanish, Romanian, French, Portuguese, Fulani Lingala, and Creole. Now, I'd like to address why it's important to have LGBTQIA volunteer child advocates. As my colleagues have mentioned in their presentation, all of the children we serve are navigating a complex immigration system. And it's very important for us to acknowledge that they are facing said system while balancing intersecting identities and oppressions, cultural awareness, language, class, race, nationality, disability, and education. This is especially true for LGBTQIA immigrant children who are escaping violence and possibly persecution because of their LGBTQIA identity. Recruiting and appointing LGBTQIA volunteer child advocates to LGBTQIA children affirms LGBTQIA children's identities and gender expressions, and it ensures that we are creating truly safe spaces when advocating for their best interests, so that when those children are ready to share, I am this and I need this, they will be doing it with agency. Ultimately, having LGBTQIA volunteers allows us to address all of those intersecting identities. Now, how can you apply? So to apply, an interested volunteer must first submit a complete volunteer application. You can do that through our website or by keeping an eye out on our social media platforms where we share a call for volunteers for all of our 8 offices. You can also learn about our trainings through sister organizations when they share that same call. But this is just the first step. The volunteer application is just the first step. We have a very thorough clearance and training process that ensures all volunteers are both eligible and qualified to serve as child advocates. After the submission of a complete volunteer application, we get to know prospective volunteers through an initial screening interview. It's happening via Zoom or a phone call nowadays, a reference check, and at the required 2-day training. There's no way around that. Volunteers must also submit to an FBI background check, a child abuse and neglect check, and a medical screening for TB. TB is currently postponed because visits with children are happening virtually, but they will resume once all of this is over. Really, that's it. All of these steps just ensure that all of our volunteers are in fact eligible and qualified to serve the children that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Maritza. Before we start answering questions from our audience, which again, you can put in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, I want to run down a quick list of ways you can learn more and stay engaged in the fight to protect immigrant children facing deportation proceedings. You can find us on our website at www.theyoungcenter.org and on social media at the accounts listed. And on our website, you can also subscribe to our newsletter for action alerts, future webinar announcements, and updates on policy, or find information about hosting fundraisers or becoming a child advocate volunteer, as Maritza mentioned. One quick note regarding questions: we do have strict protocols to protect children's privacy, so there are limits to the amount of information we can share about any given individual child, and we appreciate your understanding on this matter. We have received a couple of questions already. We can start with a question for Jessie, but anybody can chime in as we're answering these questions. What are some of the ways in which the Young Center works to improve the cultural competency of its partners, shelter staff, and others who may come into contact with LGBTQIA immigrant children?
I can jump in and take the first stab at answering that one, though I'm sure my colleagues will have other thoughts to contribute as well. And I think my initial response is that there are myriad ways, right? Both kind of at the micro and at the macro levels that we can work to improve the cultural competency of the various partners and stakeholders that engage with LGBTQIA kids while they're in federal custody. You know, and it comes from the daily grind of our day-to-day casework where we're working with kids like Miguel and Jay, like you heard me and Jesse talk about, and we have, you know, informal conversations with shelter staff that we have with a great deal of humility around these issues. Like I tend to think that's kind of a foundational philosophical approach of the Young Center to engaging with unaccompanied immigrant kids is being humble about what you know and think you know, and infusing kind of that philosophical approach into all of our advocacy efforts and encouraging that same type of humility with the partners that we deal with. At the same time, you know, because of our casework and the number of children that we're able to serve at any given time, we're also able to identify trends or maybe policies that aren't, you know, sufficiently considering, you know, certain aspects of cultural competency or, you know, the rights of LGBTQIA kids in custody. We can elevate those issues and those trends that we see to our policy team and help equip them to engage in kind of that macro level advocacy, that higher level advocacy with federal agencies and folks on the Hill as they see fit to hopefully, you know, have a part in advancing more structural changes in the treatment of LGBTQIA youth in federal custody.
Thank you, Kelly. Is anybody else chiming in before I move to the next question? Just realized I might have cut someone off. Hopefully not. We have another question about opportunities for volunteering in Maine and New England, and I'll go ahead and take that one. Our 8 regional offices where we operate around the country are in Chicago, New York, DC, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Arizona, Houston, San Antonio, and on the border in Harlingen, Texas. And those are our primary locations right now where we recruit and train volunteer child advocates. We do have a less intensive volunteer opportunity in that the Child Advocate Program, our staff is always really clear with people. It is a serious commitment that does not always mesh with the demands of people's lives. But we have a group called the Young Center Ambassadors, who you can also learn more about on our website. The ambassadors work with us throughout the year on more one-off brief engagements in support of different campaigns like Giving Tuesday, in action alerts when we are driving public attention on social media or through calls to ICE or Border Patrol about individual families or children who we are hoping to apply public pressure to get a specific result or stop a deportation. And so if you're not near one of our regional offices, we strongly encourage you to check out the Young Center Ambassadors and learn more about that, how that group works on our website. I have another question here. Sorry, I'm just making sure. Is there a wait time for applying to be a volunteer? I applied a month ago and have not yet heard back. And Maritza, I'm turning that one right over to you.
Yes. First, I just want to say that we match kids to volunteers based on their unique skills and needs. And once there's a kid you can serve, we will get in touch with you. And second, I do want to say that some of the offices, for example, located in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, they do have like a longer wait time for volunteers because, and we are very grateful for this, there are many, many volunteers that apply in those offices specifically. And the vetting process for the volunteers takes a little bit longer because we're looking through all of those applications and calling all of those references. And it's one volunteer coordinator doing that for every office. So yes, please be patient. And, sometimes we just got to wait, but we are grateful. Thank you so much for applying.
Thank you, Maritza. Next question. Are staff who work within the ORR shelter provider network eligible to volunteer as child advocates? And I believe, Kelly, you're taking that one.
Yes, unfortunately, folks who work at the facilities within ORR's network are not going to be eligible to volunteer with the Young Center, including that would also include folks who work with other stakeholders within the system, right? To us, our independence from other stakeholders is key to the recommendations that we make. And it's really important that the kids understand that their communications with us are confidential and won't be shared with other stakeholders. So we really need to kind of maintain those firm boundaries between us and other stakeholders in the system that unaccompanied kids are moving through.
You. I'm not sure who's taking this next question, so I'm going to rely on you guys to jump in after I read it. Have you worked with non-binary youth in detention? And if so, how have you advocated for those youth in such a binary shelter system?
I can jump in again here, but I will say that I have not worked, and I'm not aware of a case in my region anyways, specifically with a child who identifies as non-binary. And in my experience, that's typically because, as we talked about a little bit in the presentation, most of the kids that we work with who we would label as members of the LGBTQIA community, they might not be ready to label themselves that way yet, or to label themselves specifically one way or another. Most of the youth that I've worked with in my experience, and again, my colleagues might have a different experience, are very much in a process of exploration when we are working with them, right? We're most commonly appointed to kids who are in federal custody, which means they're relatively recently arrived to the United States. Many of them might have come here fleeing, fleeing danger in home country that they were facing on account of their initial exploration of their sexual or gender identities, and are still really coming to terms with all of that and going through their own exploration process, and might not be comfortable being labeled one thing or another until they are out of custody, as you heard Jessie talk a little bit about in her case involving Jay, where they might feel more safe and more supported in identifying one way or another. That's been my experience. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in to add something about their own.
If anybody jumps in, I will remute myself if that comes up. We do have another question from someone who says, hello, and thank you for doing this. And we are grateful for your response, for your gratitude. Thank you. I'm wondering if you could talk about the share of LGBTQIA children you tend to see in a year, especially in years like 2014, 2019, where there have been larger numbers of kids arriving at the border, and how does the process work for kids to get in touch with you? And I will rely upon one of our program staff to talk about the referral process and how referrals come to us. I can say that at the Young Center, we have only recently been tracking numbers of LGBTQIA kids in our referrals, and I am not aware, someone please jump in, correct me if I'm wrong, of the government currently keeping track of this information in a way that would allow us to really analyze that data. So it would be extremely useful for us as an organization to know how many kids coming into ORR custody identified as LGBTQIA, but I do not think that that is currently something that they are keeping track of. And then Jose or Kelly or Jessie, can you talk about the referral process and how the cases come to us about these kids?
Right, so unfortunately, the kiddos are not in a position to be able to reach out directly to us and request a child advocate, and many of them are actually unaware that they would be eligible for that as they're entering into the system, into the Office of Refugee Resettlement System. However, we do rely on the folks who work in shelters around the country, as well as the many other stakeholders who are involved in interacting with the kids as they go through the system here in the States, to reach out to us. So we are constantly being in touch with those stakeholders, with shelter providers, with legal services providers, with folks who operate the ORR shelter systems on a higher level as well, and many other stakeholders to identify kiddos that could be in need of a child advocate for many reasons. We tend to focus in on a certain level of vulnerabilities in kids that we can identify. And of course, kids who are struggling with identity issues or struggling to express themselves and have trouble relating to shelter staff are going to be identified through the shelter. And we have a system within our website for folks to be able to reach out to the Young Center and make these referrals. So if you go to theyoungcenter.org as a stakeholder in our system, there's a space to make a referral. And there we get a lot of identifying information about kiddos, where they're located and whether or not we have an office nearby. These days, it's a little easier to move forward on some of those referrals because we're doing things virtually. It allows us to really be in touch with a lot more children around the country. But for the most part, our contacts with kids and our assignment as child advocate comes through other people who interact with children.
Thank you, Jessie. And I have a more big picture question. So again, I'll leave it open to you as to who wants to jump in to respond. What are some of the changes you'd like to see in the immigration system to better care for LGBTQIA children?
I could try to take a stab at this. I think that first and foremost is for the immigration system to really take into account a child-centered and best interest approach to every decision that is being made for youth maneuvering through this system. The immigration system is one of the many systems few systems that does not take into account the child welfare approach that maybe other systems do. I mean, the best interest approach that many other systems do that deal with child welfare. And that's problematic and very concerning because and many times youth and children, specifically LGBTQIA youth and children, are being seen as adults, or even decisions are being made without taking them as a person, as a whole person into account. So that's one that I could think of. And a lot of times, and we've seen this through that the immigration system is not equipped to meet the needs of the LGBTQIA youth and children, that if there was more access for them, for more community-based organizations that do have these skills, that do have this expertise to better engage with youth that are part of the LGBTQIA community, I think it will go a long way for their experience, but then also for them as they maneuver through the system.
I second everything Jose just said, and just kind of wanted to follow up on his point about greater access to community-based resources. And I think one way in which all kids, but as it pertains to this discussion, LGBTQIA kids could access those resources if the federal government had a greater number of initial placements in custody that were community-based, that were with short-term foster care placements, as opposed to the more restrictive shelter facilities that many of the youth find themselves in, which Jose talked about, or it can be like highly gender normative and be a difficult place for a child to explore their gender identity or sexual orientation. And along those same lines, that exploration process it's going to be easier for almost all kids when they are out of custody and with their families, right? Where they feel safer and supported, generally speaking. So, steps to expedite that release process and continue to cut down on the length of time that kids are in federal custody will ultimately benefit LGBTQIA kids in helping them get to a safer place to really meaningfully engage with the exploration of their identity.
Thank you both. We have one more question, a follow-up question. Do you stay in touch with the kids you have worked with after their immigration cases resolve? And I believe Jessie is answering this one.
Yes, so we certainly do. Kids are in ORR care for a specific amount of time, depending on the particulars of their cases. But once they do or are released from shelter, our weekly visits are less frequent. However, we do maintain contact with them and make sure to give them information before they leave about how we can remain in touch. We tend to make regular contact with kids after they're released just to check on well-being, whether there's an immigration attorney attached to their case, whether their reunification with family, how that's going, if there are any support services that we can identify for them or connect them to folks in their own communities that do that kind of work. And it's typically a very appreciated kind of relationship where we're able to check in with the kids and they welcome the phone calls. They don't have communication with ORR staff once they leave the shelters. That's prohibited, so that we're their sort of only link to their previous sort of time in ORR care. And there are oftentimes questions about school and about relationships and about any aspect of the kid's life that we can remain in touch with them about. And over time, we'll, change that relationship to a less frequent contact and get to a point where the kids are comfortable not being in touch as often.
Thank you, Jessie. Next question, and I think this might be our last one, depending on the length of the answer. Do you have any knowledge of the legal outcomes in immigration court for some of the LGBTQIA youth? And Kelly is going to be answering this.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I don't have statistics at my fingertips, but what I can say is that what will be outcome determinative in most cases will be whether or not a child has an attorney who is representing them as they navigate the immigration system. As many of you may know, unaccompanied immigrant kids in federal custody are not appointed attorneys to help them seek relief from deportation. So it's a big part of the work that we do here at the Young Center, is making sure that they are connected with legal services and facilitating that child's communication with their attorney, their rapport building with their attorney, and ultimately supporting their attempt to seek relief from deportation through the provision of a best interest recommendation that supports their legal case. Kids are far more likely to be granted the opportunity to remain safe here in the United States if they have legal representation helping them navigate the US immigration system.
And just to support, when Kelly says far more likely, there are studies that have shown that a child without an attorney has about a 10% chance of being granted safety in the US, and a child with an attorney anywhere from 75 to 80% chance of having that asylum request or other immigration status granted. So it is a dramatic impact, and the work that our Child Advocate Program does, ensuring that all these children, in addition to having child advocates, also have legal representation, is critical to that outcome. Thank you so much, everybody, for the terrific questions. A recording of this webinar with the slides and a transcription will be available on our website in a few days. The transcription takes just a bit of time. We will also share it on social media and email it to everyone who RSVP'd to today's event. And finally, thank you everyone for being on our side in this ongoing fight to preserve immigrant children's rights. We are incredibly grateful for your support. Have a terrific week all. Thank you.